Hello teachers, it's Gary from eFuture, and today in this video I'm going to present to you how to be more confident in class as a teacher. So I'm going to go over some tips and some ideas on how to improve as a teacher and therefore be more confident in class. Okay? So some things I'll be going over today. So first I'll be going over lesson planning, why is it important, and what parts of a lesson. Then planning the class. What do we look for? What kind of preparation do we need to do? Then during the class, what do we need to look for during the class for our students, as well as some other key points that we need to do. Then after the class, reflecting and having some final tips and thoughts for you. Okay, so let's get started with lesson planning. Okay? So for lesson planning, why is it important? What are the important things? So, first one here, inspiration. So when we lesson plan as a teacher, once we have the plan thoroughly laid out, a lesson plan will help us inspire to be better teachers. How can we make our lessons better? So we write it all out, look at it, and then as well try to improve it at the same time. Evaluation. So it's kind of a way to self-evaluate us as teachers. How are we laying out our plans? Okay? Organization. So this is one of the most important parts of lesson planning. It's just being organized in the class. So as a teacher, going into the class, knowing what we're going to do and what activities we're going to lay out for the students is quite important to be confident. Okay? Next is guidance. Okay? So like organization, our lesson plan is kind of a guide for us as we teach our class. And last, here we have understanding. So kind of understanding how to teach and what are the key things that we need to look out for. All right? And last, what we're talking about today, lesson planning is important because it leads to more self-confidence as a teacher. Okay? So let's go over the parts of a lesson plan. So I've laid out 8 different things here. So for the viewers here watching, please kind of think about what goes first and kind of laid out here for the lesson plan. So first, what do we have? We will go with a warm-up, okay? So we'll start with the warm-up and review. A lot of times, some teachers will go into class and try to start the lesson directly, but with teaching English, it's very important for the students to kind of switch their brain a little bit to use the second language. Okay? So warm-up kind of activates the students' English a bit. Okay? So after the warm-up, what comes next? Background knowledge. Okay? So we're trying to tap into what they already know and also kind of easing into using English in the class, in this lesson. So after the background knowledge, we go with provide input. So the input is what the students will be learning this lesson. Okay? So after the inputs, checking and comprehension. So it's important to have checking comprehension after the input. Because if after the input is given to the students, if they don't understand, then kind of the lesson breaks down a little bit afterwards. So making sure they understand what they're being taught, and then they can move on to the next step of output time. So if they have no comprehension of their input, the output isn't going to be, the best. Okay? So once we give them the output time, then we go into the feedback. Okay? So they've done a worksheet, they've done writing some sentences, they've done some practice. Now is the time to kind of give a little bit of kind of tips to the students, what they need to fix. Okay? So trying to focus on those. Okay? Then after that, once the students have kind of comprehended and understood the output and the input, then we have the review game or activity. So from here, this is where the students produce by themselves. Okay? So more production. And then at the end, we have reflect on class. So this is kind of outside of the actual lesson, and it's more just for the teacher. Okay? So what parts come from the book and what parts come from the teacher? So which parts of the lesson plan come from the book would be the provide input, the provide output, and also review game activities. So these would be something that you would find in your books, that you would have to prepare yourself. And everything else comes from the teacher. So some things come from both, so like review game and activity can also come from the teacher. So if maybe you didn't like the activity that was in the book and you have something else, then maybe you could do it that way. So these are kind of the steps we want to take during a lesson. All right? So now let's go into planning the lesson. So we know what parts of the lesson plan there is. Now, what kind of steps do we take in planning each of these steps? All right? So as a teacher, we need to remember that we know our students the best. Okay? So when you start a lesson, you know their English levels, you know what the students' behaviors are, you know which students might need a little more help than others, and it's good to know their interests, something that you can incorporate into your own lesson as well. So, and also the most important thing when you start a lesson is set your objectives. You need to know what the point is of your lesson. What should the students take away? Okay? So, when we're starting out as well, figure out what resources we have available to us as teachers. Okay? So this kind of phrase here, work smarter, not harder. So know what the book provides to you already. Okay? So things like scope and sequence and lesson plans, if your book already provides it to you, that's a good starting point into making a lesson plan. So here, we already have the topics, we already have some of the objectives of the lesson. That's something that you can start off with and plan around. Okay? Worksheets. Maybe you don't need to produce any extra activities. You can kind of fill them in with a worksheet. Or tests when it comes around. You have the ability to take something from your book and use it instead of having to take the time and make it yourself. So it's just making your life as a teacher easier. Okay? Making it easier. So these are the tests. So next thing to kind of think about while lesson planning is time management. Okay? So think about how much time you have for a full class. How much time do you want to give for certain activities and certain projects that you want to give to the students. So if your class is only 40 minutes, it might not be best to have a warm-up activity last for 15 minutes. You wouldn't really want that, because then it would take away from other activities and other parts of the lesson. Being flexible. So say some students might take extra time for an activity. Being flexible with maybe an extra 5 minutes for the students to finish up would be a good thing to do, and kind of adjust the time for other parts of your lesson. And think ahead. So thinking ahead for any problems that might come about during the lesson. So say you're doing a game, and maybe the students aren't understanding the instructions for the game right away. So maybe you can allocate a little bit more extra time to the game for that explanation. Okay? So what I meant by think ahead, right here as well. So things that might, like I talked about here, possibility of going over time for activities, as well as think about the students' behaviors. So if you're trying to do group activities, maybe you'll need to move students and mix and match more optimally. So if you put, say, 3 boys into one group, maybe it'll be a bit difficult to do the activity. So maybe you need to split them up a bit. Okay? So kind of thinking about these things ahead, what kind of problems and obstacles that might come in to play in your class. Okay? So next, so this is all, again, things we need to think about while we're lesson planning. So when we start a lesson or a unit, scanning the text. Okay? So in the book, I showed you the scope and sequence. It has the vocabulary in there. But again, like I said, you know your students the best. So you know what their levels are. So you would want to look into the book and maybe find some words that your students might not know that isn't on the vocabulary list. So you would want to kind of understand the level of your students and see what vocabulary you're going to pre-teach to the students. Okay? So for example, if we have these pages here, so you kind of scan through, and maybe the vocabulary list only had baseball, bat, and cap, and bag, so 4 things, but maybe they won't know what matter is. So that might be a vocabulary word that you might want to pre-teach to your students before getting into this activity. Okay? So if you're looking for a lesson plan template, you can look at the 3P lesson plan. So this talks about the presentation, the practice, and the production. So if you wanted a kind of visual representation of the steps that I talked about earlier, so if we took the presentation phase, so this is presenting the material to the students, that would come in the first 3 steps here. So mostly from the provide input, but the presentation, you would start from these first 3 steps. And then for the practice, you look here. So kind of the check and comprehension is a little small part of the practice, but mostly from the provide output time and give feedback. And then the final production, the review, game, and activity. So the production phase, this is where the students are using the language and producing, outside of the practice time. And then the reflect on class is kind of separate. It's something that you do, like I said earlier, by yourself as a teacher. Okay? So the next part is during class. So we're going to go over the lesson plan steps by step. Okay? So first, the warm-up. So I talked about not having the warm-up last for 15 minutes. You want it mostly for 3 to 5 minutes. It would be reviewing the previous lesson, and you want to make sure not to use any new language in the warm-up. Like I talked about, the warm-up is kind of the chance for the students to switch to English. So if you present them some new language, it might turn the students off in the beginning. So it would present to a kind of difficult situation for the students in the beginning and kind of turn them off for the rest of the class. Okay? So it should be fun and stress-free for the students. Okay? Something simple. Right? And then background knowledge, basically learning what the students already know. Gives you the opportunity to focus on things that the students need to work on more for later lessons. Okay? So things to, or ways to activate background knowledge. So if you were to look at this page of the book, kind of do a picture walk. Ask questions. Okay? So if we looked at these pictures, ask the students, what animals do you see? What things do you see? And it would, depending on their answers, you would see what they already know. Okay? So instead of a picture, you can also show a video and ask them questions about the video. Okay? So next, providing the input. So I talked about pre-teaching vocabulary and previewing the sentences. So it's preparing the students to learn the unit. Okay? So this would happen probably in the lesson 1 of a unit. So when I talk about pre-teaching vocabulary, so you kind of show them a picture, maybe have them guess what the word is. So here we have the word violin, and depending on the level of your students, it's okay to use their native language to show the definition of the word. Okay? So we have here, like here, this is the word read, and then you would show them the definition, and then previewing the sentences. So introducing the sentence of what are they doing, and then an answer. Showing the sentence structures before they get into the unit. So once they get to these, they already kind of have been exposed to it already and can more easily practice. Okay? So now we're at the check comprehension and provide output time. So these things I talked about with worksheets, activities. If you're practicing speaking skills or reading skills, you can do role play. And then partner work, and if you want, maybe just do activities from the book as well. Okay? So you would provide time for the students to do all these, and then check their feedback. Okay? So with these providing output times, so there's different ways of interacting in class. So most of the time, there's a lot of teacher-student interaction. So you're introducing the language, you're introducing the vocabulary. It's just the teacher talking with the student. And then when you ask the students questions, then we move into a student-teacher interaction. What we want to try to do is maximize more time for the students to talk to each other. So if we're doing partner work and role play, as a teacher, we kind of take the back seat. And the students will talk with each other more and use the language a bit more. Okay? So now giving feedback. So when we give feedback to the students, try to use the sandwich method here. So what this is you take, first you give the students some good points, what they did well. Okay? And then you kind of sandwich in some feedback, tell them things that they need to fix. And then kind of at the end, again, pointing out positive points. So it's trying to keep the student in a more positive mindset. If we only just give areas of improvement for the students, they can get easily discouraged and kind of think negatively about their abilities. So kind of keeping that in mind is a good way to give feedback to the students. So highlighting good points, but then slowly adding in some areas that they need to fix. And then last, games and review. It's important that the game has a purpose. We don't just play a game to play a game. So thinking about which game you play, it's like, okay, this game I'm going to focus on speaking, or the students will practice reading. So what is the point? Think about what is the point of the game that you're playing. Okay? Have a clear target for the students. Right? And now going to after the class. So after the class is finished, and you're alone in your office or you're thinking to yourself, think about how your class went. Okay? What things do you want to change? So whether you want to cut down the time of your warm-up activity or your output activity, or you didn't like the activity as a whole. Or say you did a group activity and your class management, say you wouldn't want student A with student C anymore. So next time you do a group activity, you would kind of rearrange the students. So these things I would kind of keep note of after you have your lesson, and maybe think about what went well, what didn't go well, and other things that you liked from your lesson. Okay? So now some of my final tips for you. Hopefully this has been helpful for you so far. So some extra tips about the lesson plan. Try to create distinct stages of the lesson. So I talked about the 3 Ps. So that's where the practice, production, and presentation stages come in. Remember to have your learning goals and objectives. So look at your scope and sequence. Use a syllabus. Manageable chunks is kind of like the time management focus. Students, depending on their age, have very short attention spans. So make sure, if 20 minutes might be too long for an activity and the students lose interest. So these are things to kind of look out for more. And then try to vary the interactions like I talked about. So having teacher-student and student-teacher and student-student. There's a time and place for each type of interaction. And remember about some teachable moments. So teachable moment is kind of an unplanned opportunity for the students to learn something. Students are very curious, so if they ask a question about certain things, you can use that question and kind of incorporate it into your lesson and teach them something in a real world example. Okay? And last thing we have to remember, not only are our students learning, but as teachers we are learning ourselves. Okay? Every class is an opportunity to learn. Okay? We're not perfect as a teacher from the first step into the classroom. Every class we can learn something about our class and about our teaching style that we can kind of progress as we move forward. So don't get too discouraged about, oh, my class didn't go well. Confidence is built up over time. So it's just learning from mistakes, learning from different trials, and taking those experiences into your future lessons from what you learned. And as time goes by, your confidence will go up. And that's kind of what I believe and what's happened from my own experience. So I hope that you learned something from this video and that in the future when you go into your classrooms, you know that you can be well prepared and how to prepare your class and become a confident teacher. So I hope everything goes well, and I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.